Michael's just getting me used to wearing these reading spectacles. You might excuse me if I read off cue a little bit. I think it is quite appropriate that Margaret mentioned Michael's former teacher in her introduction, because what I want to talk about is Mike. Without a doubt, this is one of those joyous occasions that we, or at least I, only get a few of in a lifetime. And it's my honor to be here to celebrate my friend and colleague and erstwhile older brother, Michael Parker. However, when Michael encouraged me to come here this weekend, I have to admit I was more than a little hesitant. But what on earth could I possibly add that couldn't be said with more eloquence or authority than, say, Kathy Porres or Elizabeth Hudson? Just do what you always do, Michael advised. Well, Michael, be careful what you wish for. I've consulted with the Greensboro Jim Clark, to use the conference lingo, and I'm going to pull a lot of fishtails from the cooler tonight. No, I'm just kidding. I have talked to a few of your former students, and I will invoke them. Of the stories I'd like to share, I thought I would start with this one because it's something that is repeated year after year, long past the time that Michael's promotions and publications and awards and many of his fellow writers would deem as foolish. But first, I would like to provide a little context here. Years ago, when I tried to romantically describe my position at UNCG to an old friend back in Georgia, he said, "Oh, so basically you're a ham and egger." And I must have made a funny face, because he went on to explain, "You're the first guy in at 8, you shuffle around a bunch of unimportant paperwork, you go home at 5, you're just like every other average Joe in the country." "Right," I said. Nick's assessment may be more or less true, certainly in terms of the hours I keep, but what's important is this. More days than not, when I open the door to our hallway, I see Michael Parker sitting in his chair, student manuscript in one hand, pen in the other. And when I leave at 5, he's still there. Only now he's asking the students questions, creating that hard but necessary conversation about the work that sits between them. We do not always remember our teachers as lovely people or describe them with reverence. It's a relationship that requires attentiveness and trust from both parties, and a teacher's comments on our work can terrorize our imagination as often as it nurtures it. But I'm willing to bet that Michael would rather be remembered as a teacher as opposed to a writer. And I believe this because when I asked Michael for a list of his accomplishments, as the university quite often asks me to do, and he'll respond with the names of his students, their books, their accolades. One thing that makes Michael such a stellar teacher is the fact that he is still a stellar student. He's intellectually curious, he continues to read deeply and widely, and yet conversations with him are always accommodating and generous and honest. And honesty is one of Michael's traits that I think is worth noting tonight. Mark May Beaver, whose memoir, Suburban Gospel, will be out this fall, recalls discussing a passage of William Gass's The Peterson Kid in Michael's Structure of Fiction class. "I suggested it was a bit too dense for its own good," Mark said. To which Michael is to have replied, "Maybe the problem is more with the reader." Now, I don't know about the rest of you teachers out there, but I doubt I could have been as honest in a similar moment. Yeah, I would have deflected. I would have moved around. But for Michael, it would be dishonest and a disservice to sacrifice what is true just to ease up on the feelings of one single student. And this sort of honesty carries over into Michael's workshops as well. Recently, I was talking with Durham novelist Travis Mulhauser, and he half-jokingly recalled his first workshop with Michael by saying, and he said this very loudly, 15 years after he tore my first graduate workshop submission to shreds, I am here to publicly admit, finally, and for the first time, that Michael Parker knew exactly what he was talking about on that stormy September afternoon. He went on to say that Michael has continued this impossible streak of never, ever steering him wrong. The other large part of Michael's greatness as a teacher, in my opinion, comes from the way he observes, the way he pays attention. Michael, to my knowledge, has never been one to flinch away from the hard realities of life. And he's shown this in both his prose and his teaching. Keith Morris, a professor of English at Clemson University, recalled this about Michael's workshop. You couldn't get anything by him. You'd finish the draft of a story and read the whole thing through and think to yourself, that's pretty damn good. There's just that one little weak spot on page 7, and surely no one will notice that. Then you'd go to workshop, and then on a good day, everyone would sing your story's praises, and Michael would sit quietly, and then when everyone was finished, he'd very softly say, I thought we could talk about this one spot on page 7. He'd find it every time. When Wordsworth speaks of finding the greatest things from the least suggestions, I think it has to do with this kind of attentiveness. Getting ready to come down to the conference this weekend, I kept thinking about visiting my grandmother down here in Pamlico County. If there was a small last-minute item she needed for dinner, she would take me with her down the road to the Clover Farm grocery. It would be before dinner, so a full-on trip down the candy aisle wasn't allowed, but she'd often give me a dime to get something from the bank of gumball machines by the door. Quite often, I would get a Super Ball. You all know those kind of little... For the first few days, I always treated it really gently. I'd pull it out of my pocket. I would let it bounce on the floor, the linoleum, land softly back in my hand, put it back in my pocket. But soon enough, I'd want to see that thing really take off and fly. But that's the point of the Super Bowl, right? So for that to happen, I had to bounce it off like the hard surface of the sidewalk. I would bounce it, I would track it, I would catch it, I would bounce it again. Eventually, though, it would always hit a crack, hit a rock, and fly off beyond my reach. I think this is a good metaphor for the relationship between Michael and his students. Some students can stand for the harder surface than other students, but the quality of the work, the stories, the essays, the novels, they always trend up and away from the place they sat on the desk between student and teacher. I'll finish with this. What still seems to be amazing and right, and maybe just a little bit insane, is Michael's unending reserve of energy, how he continues to share it with those around him, his students, his colleagues, his friends. Michael is always totally there. To quote Keith Morris again, to this day, I have a little Michael Parker figure who runs around in my brain while I'm writing drafts. Is that the exact word you want? Does that move make sense in terms of the structure? Sometimes I hate that little Michael Parker figure who runs around in my brain, but I need him. We all do, Michael. And on behalf of all of your former students and your friends and colleagues, I thank you for that.